Simio is proud to announce their latest software release, Simio 11. This video will guide you through all the new and exciting features and enhancements that has been introduced to Simio since the last major release. Batch Logic Element and Standard Library Combiner. New properties. For a batch logic element or standard library combiner, you can now specify a repeat group of batch quantity requirements, batch quantities, more, that is required to be collected and attached to each parent entity. Additionally, a must simultaneously batch property has been added. For example, suppose that a combiner, the parent entities represent pallets and the following quantities and entity types are required to be packed onto each pallet. In the batching logic properties of a combiner, you can now easily model the prior example by simply specifying the batch quantity and matching rule information as a repeating list of requirements, like this. There is also a new Boolean property, must simultaneously batch, that indicates whether the full target number of member entities must be available before any can be collected and attached to a parent entity. If this property is false, then batch members will be collected from the batch logic's member queue and the combiner's member input buffer as soon as they become available. The parent entity eventually gets released once the target batch quantity or quantities are reached. If this property is true, then no batch members can be collected by a parent entity until its full target batch quantity or quantities are available. In that case, the collection of all batch members and release of the parent entity is always going to happen as a single event at a single point in time. Note that one possible result of forcing simultaneous batching is parent entities may jump over other parent entities in the parent queue if requirements differ between parents. For example, if there is only one member entity waiting, but the parent entity at the front of the queue needs two member entities, then that parent entity will have to wait until two are available before collecting any. However, if a parent entity behind it in the queue needs only one member entity, then that parent will be able to immediately collect it, thus jumping the queue ranking. Data Table, Row Editing in Property Grid. Within the facility window, when a user selects an object or multiple objects, the property grid is provided for data input. We have now added this capability to Data Table Row Editing. When a single or multiple rows are selected within a data table, the property grid now displays the column data for a single row or common data for multiple rows. This enables the user to multi-select or filter to rows and more easily edit multiple fields. Data Table, Data Binding Import Enhancements. Within data tables, when a table is bound to a file, a message will be shown displaying the time of the last import, X days, Y hours, and Z minutes ago. If the data table is bound to a file, but data not yet imported, that will be noted as well. Also, within data tables, there is now an option to import the bound data upon loading the simulation model. This option is available with Simio RPS only. Input Parameters, Table Value Enhancements. Within input parameters, when an input parameter is based on a table value, the user now has more flexibility on what data within the table data is sampled. There is a new Ignore Zero Values property that may be used to filter out zero values from the table. If this property is set to true and zero is sampled, the simulation will simply resample. Additionally, the user may specify a starting index, which defaults to 1, and/or ending index, which defaults to all. Simio will then only sample from that subset of rows. Project Home Ribbon, Modeling Helper Add-ins, RPS only. Users can now author design time modeling helper add-ins. These are pieces of code bound to a specific model. The place a user starts to implement them is the Simio API.extensions.imode iHelper add-in interface. They get loaded with the model and unloaded when the model is closed. They have access to the full iModel Design Time API. They can subscribe to events on the model, right now only save. They can augment the model's property display and put their own properties in there as well. They specify an environment under which they are valid to run. Right now, the only section is desktop. A normal Simio install will have no model helpers installed along with it. By selecting something in the drop list, the user enables or disables that add-in for the active model. Once any add-ins have been enabled, that will disable undo, redo. Simio will make sure you know this. Enabled add-ins can optionally add their own properties alongside the model's properties. Batch Logic Element and Standard Library Combiner. Release Batch Early Triggers. For a batch logic element or standard library combiner, you can now specify options for releasing batches early, either based on time or events occurring in the system. Release batch early triggers repeat group properties. The release batch early triggers defined for a parent entity can be either time-based, trigger fires when specified wait duration expires, or event-based, trigger fires when a specified event occurs. By default, the release decision when a trigger has fired is always, but may alternatively be conditional or probabilistic. Off-shift rule for secondary resources. Switch resources if possible. Previously, when a secondary resource was used within an object for general processing or within task processing, the user had two options for off-shift rule, including suspend processing and finish work already started. We have now enhanced the off-shift rule to also include switch resources if possible. This will allow processing to continue when a shift change occurs, which changing the secondary resource. For example, first shift worker and second shift worker are members of a worker list. At a server, if a process begins at 3:45 p.m. during first shift and lasts for 3 hours into second shift, when the first shift worker goes off shift, Simio will seize a second shift worker, if available, to continue the processing the entity at the server. Task, new function. We have added a new task function. Task.primaryToken returns a reference to the token that is executing the task's primary process. Seize and release step, multiple enhancements. To support the above switch resources if possible option for off-shift rule, we have added several properties to seize and release steps. First, within the seize step, we have added a quantity type property under advanced options that indicates the type of resource quantity to seize. The options are specific, which represents the exact quantities entered in the number of objects and units per object's properties, and deficient, which is derived by subtracting the already seized resources of the specified resource type from the quantities entered in the number of objects and unit per object properties. For example, if the number of objects property is specified as 5, and the number of already seized resources that meet the requirement is 3, then the deficient number of resource objects to seize is calculated to be 2. Then, within both the seize and release steps, we've added a seize resources filter type property that can be set to none or token. With the token option, an additional property named filter token reference can be specified. To see how these new properties are used, please review the on-secondary resource capacity changed process within a subclassed server or review the Simio help for these steps. Unrelated to the switch resources of possible enhancement, the seize and release steps now include a use strict list referencing property. For the seize step, if seizing from list and quantity type is deficient, this indicates whether the already seized resources must have been seized from the same specified list, instead of merely being members of the list. For the release step, if releasing from list, this indicates whether the released resources must have been seized from the same specified list, instead of merely being members of the list. This is particularly useful when resources are members of multiple lists. Create step, enhancement. Within the create step, we've added the option to create a new token into the process. The create step may now be used to create new entity objects of a specified type, create copies of an existing entity, or to simply create new tokens that reference existing objects. New tokens associated with the created or referenced objects will exit the created exit point of the step. When a new token is created using the create step, the user can specify the token associated object and/or the token context object. If not specified, the associated object reference and/or context object reference of the original token executing the create step will be assumed. Allocating resources when capacity increased. Advanced compatibility setting change. In Run Setup, Advanced Compatibility Settings, the default value for new models of the schedule late current event to try allocating when resource capacity increased compatibility setting has been changed from false to true. This setting indicates whether to schedule a late priority current event to try allocating whenever the capacity of a resource has been increased. Otherwise, allocation will be immediately attempted before the execution of any other simulation logic in the system. In the standard library, the vehicle and worker objects on-capacity changed process logic has also been modified to delay for epsilon time when coming on shift before any attempt to allocate the vehicle or worker resource. If using the switch resources if possible off-shift rule for secondary resource requirements at a server, this change now means that the default behavior of that feature is WIP tasks. Attempting resource switching will have priority seizing secondary resources coming on shift before any new tasks that have been waiting in the resource allocation queues are able to try to seize. Seize selection goal enhancement. In Run Setup, Advanced Compatibility Settings, and always use Seize Selection Goal when checking Resource Allocation Queue compatibility setting has been added. This setting indicates whether a seize step selection goal should be used not only at the initial seize attempt, but also whenever any resource allocation queue check occurs, if waiting for resources is necessary, regardless of the must simultaneous seize option setting. The recommended value for this setting is true, but will be set at false for older models built prior to Sprint 186. In a simple example, suppose an entity is waiting to seize from a worker list, but all the workers are currently off shift. Thus, the entity waits in all the allocation queues of the resource candidates. Then suppose all the workers in the list come on shift. In the old software behavior, if the compatibility setting is left at false for an old model, whichever candidate's resources shift change happened to be processed first, usually based on the order that objects were placed in the model, was always the resource seized. The selection goal, i.e. resource selection rule, specified on the seize step would be ignored. Now, what happens is regardless of which candidate resource happens to be checking its allocation queue, an entity always tried to seize the best candidate resource per the specified selection goal on the seize step. In the simple worker example described above, all the workers come on shift, and then the entity seizes the best one per whatever resource selection rule has been specified. This has always been the way things worked if using the must simultaneously seize option, but now that behavior is consistent across the board. Experimentation. Scenario timestamp. We have added the ability to add a scenario timestamp column to the experiment scenarios. To view this column, right-click on a column header, such as status, required, or any column header in the experiment view. Select Column Band Chooser, and a small box appears. In the box, double-click Last Run Completed At. It now appears next to Status column. To hide the column, right-click Last Run Completed At, and select Hide this column. Entity Gantt Constraint Destination Enhancement RPS Edition. We have added the destination availability constraints information on the entity Gantt, now shows the name of the parent item where entities are queued. The constraint log column named Facility Location now tracks the entity location. New project templates. We have removed the scheduling and wonder-where MES buttons found on the content ribbon within the Data tab. Users can now use the File New from Template option to view a selection of templates that are pre-installed with Simio. Users may also create their own templates by just saving a project file, ideally with a name, icon, and description set in the project properties, and saving it to the project templates location. C Drive, Users, Public, Documents, Simio, Project Templates. Project Recovery Files option. In File Settings within the Application Settings window, there are now two new settings for project recovery. By default, this feature is off, as the minutes between recovery save is set to 0, and the save for auto recovery before run is set to false. If a user was to turn one of those on to get a recovery save, wait the time limit or run, then end Simio using end task through the task manager or other unexpected crash, the next time a Simio instance starts up, the user will see clicking OK opens the recovery save, saves it in a new file named Project Name, Recovered, and deletes the recovery save. Clicking Cancel keeps the recovery save. Users can explicitly delete them by deleting the contents of Local App Data Simio Recovery Directory, where %local app data % is configured on most systems to be C Drive, Users, Username, App Data, Local. Seize Step Enhancement. The seize step now includes an immediately try seize property that allows the user to specify whether to immediately seize any available resources or to allow other same-time events within Simio's event calendar to occur prior to seizing any available resources. This feature is used within the Switch Resources if Possible logic for secondary resources off-shift rule option. Workstation object within standard object library, deprecated. The workstation object has now been deprecated from the standard object library. Note that any models that include workstation object instances will continue to see the workstation object in the library. Existing models that do not contain any workstations, as well as new models, will not have that object visible within the library. Object visibility within a library, updated. The visible in library model level property has changed to library visibility. A user can explicitly show or hide deprecated objects from the library right-click menu. This menu item is only enabled for libraries with deprecated objects in them. Note that a deprecated object will be shown if it has any instances in the associated model, no matter the Show Deprecated Objects setting. A new Immediately Try Allocate Boolean property is now available for the release step. Note that the default value of this property is true, the present behavior. This feature is useful when multiple resources may be released simultaneously, as setting this property to false will allow entities in resource allocation queues to wait until all resources have been released before attempting to allocate a resource to an entities based on any resource selection rules. Server, Combiner, Separator, Filler, Emptier Enhancement. For server, combiner, separator, filler, and emptier objects, we have added a process logic, other processing options category in the properties window with immediately try seize and immediately try allocate when released properties. By default, those properties are false and true respectively. Note that for any model saved in an earlier library object version, both those properties will be loaded with the value true, as that was the previous implicit behavior. The default of immediately try allocate when released for the primary resource is set to true, so that by default, the process logic will allow a new entity waiting for the server, or other object type, to immediately seize it when the server has been released by the previous entity, so as to potentially be first inserted into allocation queues for secondary resources before any secondary resource allocation attempts occur. For all the same objects, there are also the same new properties within the Secondary Resources, Resource for Processing, Advanced Options category as they relate to the secondary resource. By default, those properties are both false. Note that for any model saved in an earlier library object version, both those properties will be loaded with the value true, as that was the previous implicit behavior. For a server, combiner, or separator object, if using the process type task sequence within the Resource Requirements Advanced Options category in the Properties window of a processing task, there are new Immediately Try Seize and Immediately Try Allocate when released properties. By default, those properties are both false. Note that for any model saved in an earlier library object version, both those properties will be loaded with the value true, as that was the previous implicit behavior. Updated symbit. We have added updated symbits during this release. Updated Combine Multiple Entity Types onto Palettes. This new symbit replaces the previous Combine Multiple Parts task sequence. This symbit essentially models the same example, but now simply uses the new batch quantities repeat group on the combiner to define the batch quantity requirements. Task sequences, extra process logic, data tables, etc. are no longer required to model this sort of problem. Updated Combiner Releasing Batch Early. This new symbit replaces the previous reneging combiner symbit. This new symbit simply uses the Release Batch Early Triggers feature instead of a parent input buffer renege trigger approach with a standalone extra node that then reroutes the entity back into the combiner, extra state assignments to recalculate available batch quantities, etc. Workstation symbits, updated to server symbits. Server with material consumption. This new symbit replaces the previous Workstation with material consumption symbit. This new symbit uses the Material Requirements section of properties within a server task sequences to consume and produce materials required for processing. Server with Material Consumption and Replenishment. This symbit is a second model within the above Server with Material Consumption project and replaces the previous Workstation with Material Consumption and Replenish symbit. In addition to using the task sequence type processing for material requirements, it also uses monitor elements to track the material inventory and produce steps within processes to handle material replenishment. Scheduled material arrivals. This updated symbit includes now material consumption within the task sequence type processing of a server instead of within a workstation object. A data file is used to specify material arrival times into the system. Scheduled material arrivals with deviation. This updated SIMBit now includes material consumption within the task sequences of a server instead of within a workstation object. The model shows how variation around the material arrival times affects a system. Using relational tables. This updated SIMBit now uses server objects in place of workstation objects in the facility window. The model includes data that exist in different tables, and the tables are linked together with foreign keys, as in a relational database. Server with sequence-dependent setup. This new SIMBit replaces the previous workstation with sequence-dependent setup SIMBit. The server uses task sequence type processing to specify sequence-dependent setup between various part types in the system. Financials. This updated SIMBit now includes server objects in place of workstation objects. The model demonstrates how to calculate costs, such as capital cost of objects, usage costs, holding costs, and the cost of transporting an entity on a vehicle. Relational tables and repeating property. This updated SIMBit now uses servers in place of workstations for processing multiple patient entity types through a system. Relational data tables are used to specify different processing times, as well as multiple doctors and/or nurses for processing, for the patient types.